All right, thanks for having us. I'm Nadya. I'm the psychologist in this team.
And I'm the philosopher.
So all the difficult questions go to her. I'm just going to start. So actually, I think our presentation kind of started while we were waiting because some people started asking us questions about dinosaurs and wondering why they're there. And this is exactly the phenomenon that we are going to be talking about. This phenomenon experiencing the need for explanation, and we are going to be talking about when it arises, when it should arise, when it should not arise, and things like that. Now, in case you were totally cool with the dinosaurs and all the talks you've been to today had dinosaurs on the first screen, here's another example from just an article online by Olivia Goldhill about a shoe museum in Toronto, Canada, where the senior curator noticed that visitors were fascinated by an unfamiliar practice of Chinese foot binding. They wanted to have an explanation for why they did this, but they were curious about how women came to wear high-heeled shoes. Now, that phenomenon did not elicit need for explanation, even though there was actually, if you read the work of Elizabeth Semmelbeck, there is an interesting backstory to that. Apparently, this goes back to 10th century, where Persian cavalrymen were wearing these shoes because apparently it's really comfortable if you're on horseback, because your feet don't slide. So here's another example of using high heels for this purpose of horse riding in the 15th century. Then European traders were visiting Persia. They thought this was kind of an interesting practice, so they took over the fashion. European men started wearing high heels, and because men of course were cooler than women, it was the cool look, women started trying to mimic that. So in order to look masculine, they started to wear high heels. And then there was a period of enlightenment when all the frivolous and necessary things were shed for men, and women retained the high heel. Even so, now it's taken to be a sign of femininity. So I think it's a pretty, there is a story, there is an explanation to why women are wearing high heels today, but it wasn't something that people wanted to know. Now there are several accounts, both descriptive and normative, about what does and does not elicit need for explanation. Probably the earliest account and probably most intuitive is this idea of surprise. So if the observation surprises you, if a green monster suddenly pops up, you didn't expect one, you're surprised, you might want to have an explanation for why is it there. Now, this account was criticized by Grimm, who said that there are cases when you are not necessarily surprised, but you still might want to have an explanation. Like if your bike keeps squeaking, it's a very familiar sound, you're not surprised at all by the sound, but you might still want to know why it's squeaking. So this proposal states that a fact stands in need of explanation for a specific person when they can think of counterfactual alternatives to it. So it's very salient to you. The alternative world where your bike is not squeaking is very salient to you. So you have this whole combination of the actual world with the squeaking bike, an alternative world, non-squeaking bike. You want to know what distinguishes those two and why we are in this world and not in that world. So the next account is what Wong and Udell wanted to point out that both of those accounts are descriptive. They wanted to propose a normative account, and they called it map mismatch. So they introduce an idea of a map, which they define as an understanding of some part of the world, a theory in the sense of a collection of interrelated concepts and beliefs that allow us to make sense of what has happened, predict what will happen, and decide what we should do. So you might have this little mental accounts of what the world is like, this little terrain that they call map. And if you have an observation that does not fit your map, that should trigger the need for explanation. So they emphasize that the maps are personalized. So one example they give is, for example, if you are probably a person like me who's not an expert in primates and in tropical forest ecology, if you were walking in the evening through the forest and you heard calls of certain monkeys, that would fit your map of what generally happens in the forest. But an expert on specific types of monkeys that live in this forest who might have a map saying that either this type of monkey is not found, should not be in this part of the forest at this time of the day, or they do not produce this type of cry at this time of the day. For them, there would be a mismatch between the observation and their map, the more detailed, specific map of that situation, that part of the world. So for them, hearing the cries of the monkeys at that time should trigger need for explanation. For you, it should not. They talk about different types of possible errors that you under this account that you might have to deal with. They focus on false alarm errors. So basically, when you're seeking an explanation when you should not. So for like one example is having a wrong map. So you might have a map that the Earth is flat, and you might wonder why the water is not pouring off the edge. So they might say this would be a case because there is a wrong map. They wouldn't say that you should seek an explanation. Now, we are mainly interested in a different type of errors, the miss errors, when you should seek an explanation but you do not. So they specifically say that the phenomenon needs an explanation only when it does not fit the theory. But we would like to point out that even a bad or false theory can offer a good fit to the data. And unnecessarily convoluted and parsimonious data might offer a great fit to the data, but it doesn't mean that you should endorse it. And it doesn't mean that you should not seek alternative explanations. So one example of a bad or false theory offering good fit to the data is Ptolemaic astronomy. Was a very complicated system where planets were doing all sorts of weird dances and looping back in order to account for the observations. It did have a good fit to data. So according to Wang and Udell, it shouldn't have triggered need for explanation. And what we want to say that in such cases it should. And we want to offer an account where we have some kind of criterion for deciding when to seek an explanation, even though the data fits your map. So we want to say that agents who value having true or elegant theories may not necessarily have to stick with their map if it fits the data, and the conflict with your map should not be necessary for triggering need for explanations. In fact, if you only update your maps on the basis of conflicting data, you will miss out on many learning opportunities. So our proposal is called the rational need for explanation. We suggest, so in general, we focus on how do we evaluate rationality of an action. We say that you need to take into account your goals and values when you're deciding what's rational. So you're deciding whether an action, so you're selecting an action based on cost-benefit analysis, where you estimate somehow the cost of that action, and you estimate the utility of that action, you calculate the ratio, and if it comes out in favor of doing it, you go for it. So lots of things can go in the cost-benefit ratio, and we'll talk about that in more detail, but that's the general idea. And we emphasize that your goals and values should go into this computation. And basically the claim is about existence of some situations where a combination of your goals, values, and the environments that you are in will make it rational to seek explanations even when there is no map mismatch. Everything fits your map. Some of these goals and values could be epistemic virtues that should be endorsed by responsible epistemic agents. Some of them might be moral virtues that should be endorsed by a responsible moral agent. And it might, the way the ratio will come out will also depend on the environment that you are in, because it can change the costs and benefits that you assign to a given action. So to unpack a little bit the idea of cost-benefit ratio, what can go in there? Well, one thing you can consider is how good is the current hypothesis that you are entertaining. You might have your best estimate of how likely it is to be true. Its predictive utility, has it generated accurate predictions so far for you? And where did you get this map or this hypothesis to begin with? Did you use good inferential processes to formulate it and to evaluate it? There are lots of statistical practices that we can use to evaluate a hypothesis based on data. There are some practices where you just kind of look at the data, and if it passes a certain criterion, you say it's good enough. My hypothesis is supported. Or you can have a different practice where you start out with many different hypotheses and you compare them. That's generally considered to be a better practice in evaluating hypotheses, but we still use both. So you would say, did I get this one just because I started with one, it fit the data reasonably well and I stuck with it, or is it because I already compared a ton of different hypotheses and this came out the winner? Also, the amount of data and the quality of the data that you use to arrive to this hypothesis could be a factor here. Then, something that might be harder to estimate, but kind of the value of arriving to a better alternative hypothesis. So you can look at your own personal history or the history of science if it's a relevant field. For example, we know that there have been cases of what you can describe as strike a conceptual jackpot when an alternative explanation was considered, even though prior explanations fit the data well. So the Ptolemaic transition from the Ptolemaic geocentric model to Copernicus model is one of those examples. Now, something that often goes under the radar, but we would like to bring it into the spotlight, is the value of just the process of looking for an explanation. Even if you don't find one, this might make you imagine that I just wasted my time. I looked for an explanation and I don't have one. But there is a growing body of research suggesting that you actually get a lot out of just the process of seeking for explanation. So some of these proposals have been developed by Tanya Lombroso and colleagues under the umbrella term of learning by thinking. The idea is that you get something somewhere you arrive to a better epistemic position just in virtue of trying to find an explanation, even if you don't. And here are a few things that an explanation has been shown the act of trying to explain has been shown to give to reasoners. It makes you focus on more relevant causal features as opposed to focusing on superficial features that distract you from finding a true underlying causal model of the event. It also promotes comparison among analogous cases and abstraction, seeing larger scale patterns in the observations that you're considering. It reveals discrepancies between the explanation and other beliefs you might have, or other evidence that you might not have thought relevant to begin with. It increases metacognitive awareness of your own failure of understanding. There is an interesting body of literature showing that people are pretty bad at evaluating their own level of understanding, especially causal understanding. So if you ask people, like, how well do you understand how a helicopter works? Or even daily things like mundane, like, how well do you understand how a zipper works? And people say, I have a pretty good idea. And if you actually ask them to explain how these things work, very quickly they realize that they have no slightest idea for a helicopter. The typical model is something like this thing rotates and the whole thing goes up. Right? This is not a very good level of understanding. And try explaining how a zipper works, how a flush toilet works, how a ball pen works, or how election system works. People tend to overestimate a lot their own level of causal understanding. And when you're trying to explain, you realize, this is where I am. I thought I'm here and I thought I'm there. And that in and of itself is already an achievement, right? If you think that you are very good at playing poker, realizing that you're not so good at playing poker might save you a lot of money in games that you choose not to play, right? So you can get somewhere, even if you don't arrive to the final understanding, final good explanation. And also going through the grid of it and experiencing the explanatory error, like, I tried this explanation, no, it's not good, I'm going to try a better one, it seems to work, but no, it doesn't work ultimately. That gives people a more advanced understanding of how science works, what the nature of science, and it pushes people away from this false idea of science as a final form. And once we have scientific evidence for something, that's it, and no further revision is necessary. That science just gives you truth in its final form. That has been shown to interfere a lot with understanding complex patterns and any kind of disagreement between scientists. So if you have a ton of evidence for climate change and then one scientist says, no, that's not true, you're like, well, something's fishy here, this is not how science works. And it's exactly how science works. And going away from this final form image of science seems to be a good way to go. Now, these are all different ways to evaluate benefits. They're also, you need to evaluate the costs of doing so. We have less to say here, but just one point is that costs are not necessarily prohibitive. If you think that it's going to be terribly costly for you to consider alternative hypothesis, maybe consider fairly recent piece of evidence from the Gopnik lab showing that even young 3-year-old children can consider unlikely but true hypothesis when the observed data is compatible with more likely but false hypothesis. And most interestingly, actual children outperform adults in this kind of tasks. So maybe for adults it could be a good practice to consider alternative explanations. So in some cases we could become as good as 3-year-olds in seeing alternative causal models of the world. So we mentioned earlier that some of the cost benefits that we want to bring into the picture are moral in nature. So we would like to point out that if the current theory that you are endorsing is morally problematic, it's associated with oppression of a group of people, if you think how terrible it would be to wrongly endorse it, that should also go into your computation of cost-benefit ratio. Like, how terrible would it be to wrongly endorse a hypothesis that, let's say, African Americans are less intelligent than European Americans? That would be a very bad thing, right? So that should, in and of itself, justify further investment in considering alternative hypotheses. Then, to unpack a little bit the idea that the cost-benefit ratio might vary or come out with different results depending on the environment that you're in, we want to rely on existing both empirical and computational research suggesting that in dynamic and uncertain environments where you do eventually end up revising your hypothesis, rational agents have extra reasons to consider alternative explanations and wait before committing to a specific hypothesis. So first, delaying commitment and also being open to considering alternatives. And there's interesting developmental evidence showing that children growing in uncertain, risky environments, in fact, show this pattern. They're less likely to commit to any causal hypothesis of the world based on a given amount of data than children that grow in more stable, certain environments. So if we wanted to add a column to this table, adding our account that we call rational cost-benefit analysis, we are also in the area of normative accounts, where the main addition, the main difference of our account, I think, comes in this last row, where you have an observation, something like a white male is hired for a certain position. This should not, or this does not and should not elicit seeking of explanations on any of the existing accounts. Like, you're not surprised by it, you don't automatically consider alternatives, also it fits your map of how things work. So you should stop there. What we are saying is there are some conditions where you are normatively required to seek explanations for why this happened, even though you don't check any of the surprise, counterfactual, or map mismatch boxes. Now, you might wonder whether there might be a catch-22 here. Like maybe a person kind of has to in a way believe or be even convinced that there is a better theory out there, and you could discover it with little effort in order for your cost-benefit ratio to tip in favor of going there, because otherwise, if you don't believe that you will discover one, what's the point of doing it? So we just want to emphasize that even under conditions of uncertainty about what's out there, what hypothesis, whether you will find good explanations, seeking them might be a rational move. And you can frame this whole situation as a case of explore-exploit dilemma. This is a pretty big topic of research in a variety of areas, from animal researchers studying foraging strategies, to artificial intelligence collecting data, to psychology. So it's often, I think it started out in foraging literature, so I'm going to use a foraging example. So if you're, say, a bear on a certain patch of the forest, enjoying your berries that you can find there, there's a certain amount of berries that you're getting out of your patch, you might want to consider whether you should switch to a different patch. Now, it could be that if you go to the next patch, it has a ton of berries and it's even better, but it could also be that there are a lot fewer berries than what you're getting now, or maybe the same. You just don't know. Now, these two options are labeled as exploiting the current option. You're just sticking with what you have, what you know. There's no uncertainty about it. And exploring, there is uncertainty about what's going to happen. You do not know the whole terrain. You don't have a map, like bird's eye map of the forest with patches and amounts of berries there. So it could be that even though it could be that you are at the global maximum. If we kind of map on the y-axis the amount of berries, and this is the map of the forest, maybe you're at the best possible patch already, and wherever you go, it's only going to be worse. Or maybe, so any other patch will be worse. So maybe even though your patch is not terrible, you're at a local maximum, there is maybe an even better patch that you could discover if you try your chances. Now, this is not limited to bears and berries. When you are deciding, should I go to a familiar Thai restaurant and eat that lovely pad Thai that I always get and it's wonderful, or should I try a new restaurant and maybe order Chu Chi Kung? You're facing exact same problem. You are saying, should I exploit my pad Khmer or pad Thai, whatever you were having, or should I explore other options? Or when you're saying, should I continue dating my current partner, or should I go on OkCupid and maybe check some other options? That's just another example of the same dilemma, right? There is uncertainty about what you're going to find out there. So we can kind of relabel the dating partners here as, you have a current map, it's working in a way, right? Should you still go and look for, check out alternative explanations? We can't tell you, like, for sure yes, for sure no. We could just tell you there are certain conditions when it might be rational for you to do that. Again, you might be at a local maximum, and some of the alternative hypotheses you check out, they might be total trash, but maybe there is a really cool one that you could find out, and unless you try searching for it, you wouldn't discover it. So we are kind of extending this idea of this dilemma of explore-exploiting, applying it to this question of exploring your hypothesis space, or in general the hypothesis space, and introduce the idea. We're introducing the idea of exploring by explaining. So in general, you could explore in multiple ways. Right? You could explore by collecting more data. That's what we call external information search. You could also explore internally by generating explanations for available observations. So if I take you back to the Thai example, you could say exploitation would be just going to your familiar good Thai restaurant. Exploring by getting more data would be going to a new restaurant. What we're saying, you could also, sit in your chair and explore explanations for why that familiar Thai restaurant is so good. Maybe it's because the chef is originally from Thailand, or maybe because they use fresh organic produce from local farms, or maybe it's located in a non-touristy area where only if you manage to retain a constant body of customers then the business would survive. So maybe just exploring this set of different explanations for already available data might put you in a better position next time you're traveling maybe, and you say, well, which restaurant should I go to? You could consider these factors. You will know better maybe how to navigate the world of Thai restaurants. This can be advantageous when data collection is costly or there are no clear guidelines for how to collect new data. This is actually characterizing a lot of modern sciences. If you take like space exploration or anything, theoretical physics is all it does basically, right? Now just building Large Hadron Collider was incredibly expensive. Any space exploration option is incredibly expensive. So we're not saying you shouldn't be doing that. We're saying you could make some progress just by mulling over the data that you already have and considering what are the hypotheses that could explain that. And again, you could combine the two if you have explored the space of hypothesis better. That might guide your next steps when you're collecting new data. You might decide what data to collect to test specific hypotheses that you have outlined. So by introducing this, so by framing it as a case of explore-exploit dilemma, we're saying that you don't run away necessarily from uncertainty about what you're going to find if you explore. You just acknowledge it, and that in and of itself is an achievement, because if you fail to acknowledge that you don't actually know for sure what generated the data that's available, that would definitely be an obstacle to learning. But at least acknowledging, even if you don't arrive to a better hypothesis, saying, I'm not 100% sure that the one I have is the right one, that's already a step forward.
So now that she did all the hard work, we're just going to summarize. So basically, again, our idea is to point out that there are going to be goals and values guiding agents in their calculations on the costs and benefits of seeking alternative explanations. And we think that there are some combinations of, there are such combinations of goals, values, and environments, in particular environments where the rational thing to do is to seek alternative explanations, even if your map, if your theory fits the data that you have available. So one concern that, of course, maybe it's already in your minds, is thinking, wait a minute, are they advocating for motivated explaining? It sounds a little bit like that, like, okay, I have a map, I have a theory, it's accounting or accounts for the data, but I don't like it. What if I'm gonna seek for some other alternative explanation that maybe I like it more, or maybe fits better with my values? We see a lot of that already, right? Like, you have data, you have a theory or an explanation accounting for the data, but still people resisting, no, I don't like that explanation, or it doesn't fit with my values. And you can think of some actors in, for example, the climate change scenario, where their values and their goals pretty much force them to look alternative explanation. Look about an oil company, for example. They are better off by seeking alternative explanation to what's going on, rather than saying, we are all, or we are contributing to what's going on. So we are not gonna say, we see this as an important concern, important objection of what we are saying. And of course, we are not endorsing the idea. We are not saying any kind of values or any kind of goals are okay, and you can always appeal to them to seek alternative explanation when you don't like the explanation that you have available, the explanation that is actually accounting for the data. So yeah, we're not encouraging doing bad science or keep pushing until you find whatever explanation fits your values, your goals, and you can just get away with that. But if you look at what we do in science, it's pretty much explaining motivated by values. So what we are basically saying is not in itself looking for explanation because you are motivated by certain values and goals, is not in itself problematic. Maybe the problem is what values are you putting there, what values are you following, what goal are you following, but not in itself, because this is what in science we see all the time. For example, like the fact that there are so many studies on sex differences, I mean, there's so many every day being done, is not value neutral. It's not reflecting just a purely, value neutral approach to let's figure out what the reality is. It's because our societies value so much sex marking and sex differentiation that we keep doing all these kind of studies looking for sex differences. So there is this observation by Helen Longino that we need to acknowledge that values are part of the scientific pictures, that the questions that we decide to pursue, the methodologies that we decide, and even when we need to decide what hypothesis or what is the standard of evidence that we need to meet before we accept a hypothesis, all those processes are guided by values. And again, this example of studies on sex difference, I think is the one that Longino uses when she makes that comment. I think it's a pretty good illustration of how science itself is not alien to this idea of following your values or specific goals when you are seeking explanations. So basically what we are basically saying, well, yeah, own it. Yeah, explanation motivated by values, that's what we do in our everyday explanations and in our explanations in science. So don't be so afraid of just acknowledging openly, explicitly, that that's what we do. Values are gonna be present. So I think with this, we are still not completely escaping this concern about, are we, saying that, or that we're not escaping completely the concern of whether or not we are paving the way for motivated explanation. But I think, again, it could be a matter of looking at those values and goals and evaluating then, are those good values or, values that we should have when we are seeking alternative explanation for a particular set of data. And that's it.
Normally what we do is for the first 15 minutes, students ask questions, and after that, we can ask questions. So until 3:45, we'll have students.
Does your theorizing and thoughts on this differentiate between beliefs and explanations that we have that serve sort of a navigational role versus beliefs and values and explanations that we have that serve sort of like a social signaling role? So, for instance, the climate change beliefs that people have aren't always just an explanation people have about the facts or about how the world works. It's a signal about what are my group affiliations, who are the people I consider respectable, ethical, and so on. And in that instance, when you have that sort of an explanation serving multiple roles, how would you push for getting people to rationally seek an alternative explanation? Would you appeal to the navigational component or appeal to the sort of identity signaling component?
That's a good point. I don't know.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What basically you're saying is that where we think there is one input to the cost-benefit ratios, there can be just a whole package, and you might select some of them or maybe combine them in some composite. And I don't know, I don't think we have a commitment for how you should deal with those values. It's kind of the part that's we bracket outside of our proposal, just like, as a person, I would tell you, you shouldn't endorse the values that an oil company endorses, and you shouldn't take that and plug it into your cost-benefit computation when you're deciding whether to explain or not. But the proposal itself is ultimately just about the process. Like we say, once you plug all those things in, you crunch the numbers, and you get some guidelines for whether to use it or not. I know that might not be super satisfying, but I think that's a separate project to decide what values should be used and what values should not be used, or goals in this case.
And I guess that maybe the idea is, depending on what actually brought you to that explanation in the first place, maybe whether you came there from some more identification with a specific group, or because you were convinced by a particular explanation just from of the data, maybe that would be the same pathway you should follow, to be more coherent or something about. But yeah, I'm not sure, but I don't know. That could be a very.
I think it's interesting because you could give an argument that it's irrational to have certain goals, right? Like if your goal is to self-destruct, someone could say it's not a rational goal. So if we are just narrowly defining our rational need for explanation as like whatever you plug in, there's a rational process for evaluating those inputs. We are isolating ourselves from that. So it's not like rational way of being or living your life. It's an interesting question. Like, is it okay to plug irrational values into rational computations? I don't know. What do you think? Anyone?
I thought that was going to refer. I think, one level of analysis, group affiliation, coalition forming, is very rational. Even if you're doing it for an irrational basis, having friends, having a coalition, that makes sense. I would probably argue that yes, on some level it is rational to have irrational beliefs, depending on what function we're serving, which would then make it harder to move people away from the irrational belief.
So with regards to the idea that we should be upfront about sort of the values that we're embedding in our science, do you have an example or sort of an idea of what that would look like?
Sorry,
What was it?
what that would be?
Yeah, would it be like a little section that every paper includes along with a conclusion, so to speak?
Yeah, there are some proposals, like for example, Heather Douglas has all these specific instructions about at what stages in the scientific process values play a role, and what kind of role we should allow them to play, and then ways in which we can make it more democratic, we can make science more democratic by openly acknowledging those values that we have been dragging in the scientific process from the values that motivated you're choosing that research project in the first place, to choosing the methodology, to so she has. I mean, there's several authors that are there's more and more, and like every year the literature on values and science keeps growing about, and be more open to this idea that let's stop discussing whether or not values play a role in science. Let's just discuss what values and and what kind of roles. So I think I'm not sure of specific instruction about how to be explicit about that, but I've read like these more like rough comments about scientists should be open about, explicit about, in their papers sometimes, like what values, they endorse in particular. I mean, that's still too, weird, because what kind of values? Like when I was a child, I really like lizards and that's why I'm doing that. That might be more irrelevant, but the most obvious one is, of course, conflict of interest you might have with your research and the funding. But there is I've been reading several authors like giving more and more detail about what that would be like, being open about that.
Yeah, revealing conflicts of interest is revealing potential goals that might have led you one way or the other. Now, like what you're saying, having a section in paper outlining values, that's like both fascinating and terribly weird. If you take any study like on sex differences, saying sex demarcation is extremely important in our society, so we couldn't help but look at that. Like,
But that could be interesting to see that openly acknowledged, because the idea is that most of the studies on sex differences, they don't acknowledge that we are obsessed with sex. We are completely obsessed. So here we are doing it again. That would be amazing to see that on a paper, like being acknowledged that because we are obsessed with sex, or maybe because we didn't find anything else in the study, but we were actually controlling for gender, and sex and gender, whatever, they're the same, and maybe acknowledging those things, at least the public can get a better idea of, what's going on.
So if there is the practice of pre-registering your studies and hypothesis that speaks to that a little bit, because you need to, what happens a lot with studies on sex and gender difference is that it's a standard demographic characteristic that of participants that's recorded for any study, no matter what you're looking at. You might be looking at their music perception or attention or memory, whatever. You record gender and age typically. And then has also been a common practice, whatever you are studying, you also enter gender as a covariate. And what has been happening a lot is that nothing actually works, but then it turns out that gender predicts the results in some ways, and you end up publishing a paper saying we found a gender difference in music perception or whatever. Because of how statistics works, even when there is no real difference, because we set a cutoff for significance at 5% chance of having the results occur by chance. If 5% of any study without underlying difference will still produce a significant difference, we end up publishing only those studies. We have a field flooded with findings of significant differences. The researchers haven't done anything wrong because they got a significant difference and they published it, but well, now we're realizing they have done wrong by not saying the study was not looking at gender originally. They had a hypothesis that maybe, listening to music in the morning improves your attention more than in the evening. That didn't work, but gender did. So the practice of registering your studies and saying we are looking at the effect of time of the day on your music perception, not gender. We're just going to enter it as a covariate, and then when you publish the study, say this is not what we were looking for. We happened to find it. It at least kind of signals what the possibility that this could be a false positive because of how statistical practices work, and also it acknowledges that these are just the things that we typically record about our participants. We do not record their pinky size, but if we did, I bet 5% of the times we would find pinky size predicting your psychological performance, academic outcomes, and economic choices. If we were interested in pinky sizes, we would have data to support that.
Okay. So I'm just curious, for the rational need for explanation as an idea or as a theory, is this supposed to be like a psychological explanation for how humans make these decisions, or is it one for this in general, like how rational agents can do a better job of making rational decisions for when they should look for explanations?
So it's a normative proposal, so it's more the second, how rational agents should. It's not a descriptive, so we do not have data showing that this is what actually people do.
Okay.
But that data would be irrelevant to our proposal because it's normative.
Okay, that's a
Yeah. Although, as a psychologist, I kind of like shivering inside saying this thing. Data would be irrelevant. What am I
You are
saying?
cool here. Yeah.
But I think it would be interesting to look at under what conditions we actually do this, seek alternative explanations. What is our tunings? Like how sensitive are we to lots of these factors that we listed when we do experience the need for explanation, and different manipulations that could make you more or less sensitive.
Colin, do you still have a question? Okay, and Adolfo.
Yeah, so it was interesting that you cited into some of the origin research. I remember the example that from like the ecology stuff, right? Like you have an animal looking for food, and they are going to search their space, and usually it's a habitat that they know. So that they're not like humans where they have this set. If they migrate, they know where they're going to migrate, but they have their set habitats, right? So I was just interested in like what you thought about sort of animal foraging for food, and now us whether trying to forage for an explanation, right? First of all, like the big difference between an animal foraging for food is that you're going to get hungry, right? So where's that hunger in, is that like the needs in sort of the rational needs that you were explaining?
Mm-hmm.
Like is that sort of like the hunger, okay, need an explanation, right?
Well, thank you for bringing this up. I think that there are lots of, just like there are lots of parallels between animal cases and human explorations, there are lots of differences. So, for example, we might not be having, like, hunger is not, so, like, for an animal, it's a growing function, and if you have diminishing energy input, you will have a growing function. It's not necessarily the case. Well, maybe with humans, you could argue that boredom serves the same function. If you're not getting your intellectual input at a steady rate, you might get bored, so kind of like hungry for new information. But maybe not. Maybe you can just be enjoying, like, oh, I can predict how the social world around me works, and this is totally fine. Like, I go to a party, I know how to move the pieces, you know, who to talk to, and it's just inherently, you know, it's fun, and you can just stop there. So I think there can be differences and similarities. What was even more interesting is the idea of the animal knowing more or less the area. So the animal might not know exactly how many berries are on each bush, but they might have some kind of general bird's eye view idea of, you know, there is a forest, there is a lake there, like don't go looking for berries in the middle of a lake, and things like that. Now, how different is it from what we have about our conceptual terrain? You could argue that, you know, you've never, by definition, you've never been to that particular patch of that hypothesis. But you might also argue that it's not a completely new terrain to you, in the sense that you have dealt with similar situations before. Like, you had your hypothesis matching the data, but maybe your hypothesis socially and morally problematic. And maybe you explored another option and you found something that was better. So you could have this higher level meta theories about what the terrain is like. And indeed, there is interesting research on hierarchical knowledge representation suggesting that the way we build our knowledge, well, it's hierarchical in many senses. Like, you might have knowledge about, let's say, specific animals, right? You might know differences between specific dogs, and then differences between dog breeds, and then differences between dogs and cats, and then differences between mammals and fish. So, and you have this whole hierarchical organization. Now, the way you arrive to having this hierarchy is not that you first learn everything about every single animal at the bottom level of the hierarchy, and then you start learning the categories. Oh, first let me meet every cat in the world, then I'm going to build category dog of cats. No. What happens is that oftentimes you learn higher level categories even before you understand lower level categories properly. And it has been shown in both computational work that, in fact, if you feed the same data that a human child receives to a computational model, it will start learning something like bits and pieces higher, at high level of abstraction, higher level hierarchies that kind of outlines the terrain. This is what animal kingdom looks like. They're clusters that contain other clusters. And that you can arrive to that knowledge before, actually, or without ever arriving to lower level representations. This is work by Josh Tenenbaum and colleagues. And this suggests that you do have some ideas about the forest, the conceptual forest that you're living in, even before exploring every piece.
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned the parallel because, so depending on, so for example, in animal foraging, and if an animal is sort of modeled in being highly uncertain, I'm just going to go and look for food. I generally know that, you know, I know very little, and I'm just going to move from event to event with almost no memory, in a sense. Or you can have the highly adaptable animal who's like, oh, I know where all my patches are, and I'm just going to try to figure out which patches to hit first. But like in the human case, if there's not this hunger for needing an explanation, right? And if it's really easy for me to sort of figure out whether, okay, what's my sort of conceptual habitat, right? All my friends are in this sort of one spectrum of this conceptual habitat, and we all know it very well, so I don't have a hunger for it. And if I ever do need to have a hunger, if I ever do need have that hunger, maybe my search pattern is going to be very sort of randomized, or not I'm not going to try to optimize for it, because I can always go back and default to sort of my sort of natural habitat. So what I'm proposing is that there are cases in which I believe that the actual pattern of the search might actually change a lot because of these sort of heavier weights of what these conceptual maps do to either us and like in our environments as well.
I think those are interesting empirical questions of how these parameters would fit to actually predict your search pattern.
There's a lot about this proposal, if I understand it right, that sounds to me like Bayesian decision theory, right? So the claim that you shouldn't just look at fit is like saying, don't just look at the likelihood, look at the posterior probability of the hypothesis being correct, which takes into account the priors, which could include things like having a preference for simpler theories and the like, and then takes the further step of Bayesian decision theory and says you shouldn't just pick the option with the highest posterior, but the one with the highest expected utility, where your values, your utility factor into the choices as well, including things like making decisions in order to obtain more information. Now, the one place where it seems to split has to do with this foraging model, this explore versus exploit, because that sounds to me like it means that I have my favorite hypothesis now, and I have to decide whether to abandon it or not to look for something else, whereas the ideal Bayesian would recognize that as soon as I introduce a new hypothesis, what might happen is the probability of one that I previously discarded might skyrocket. That is to say, the shifting probability distribution that comes from considering other options could cause me to, in a very knowledgeable way, not go either to the thing that I'm exploring to or stick with the original, but to return to a hypothesis that I considered in the past. Does that make sense? I mean, it sounds like the Bayesian decision theory approach is more normative. Mm-hmm. It's taking into account your entire history of exploration rather than just where you are now and what you're going to find next. Mm-hmm.
So it does come closer, and because there is more in the Bayesian formula than how well the data fits the theory. We are very close there. Now, what we are. So we deviate from that in several senses, several ways. Well, first, there is no way to plug values and
That's not
goals.
part of utility?
Well, it's so it's not part of the Bayesian formula itself,
Right.
but it's part. You can build it into the broader model of Bayesian decision making. So what I'm saying how we're deviating from the strict Bayesian belief updating system.
Sure.
So we are emphasizing the goals and values, and we share the spirit of saying, like, if you think about our proposal just boiled down, it's basically a very trivial idea that you should fit multiple models to your data. So in that sense, at that level, we are in complete agreement. We are saying we're turning it into so just like Bayesian, it's also a normative proposal. We're saying you should go beyond data fit. You should consider values and goals, and you shouldn't wait for any data necessarily that would contradict this. So it's a related proposal, definitely.
Thank you.
And you can, so what I was not fully able to follow, I'm sorry, I was already thinking about how to respond, was the going back and re-evaluating the hypothesis.
So typically what a good Bayesian would say is, I want the posterior probability distribution over all possible hypotheses given the data that I have. And then I use that with my utility in order to find which option maximizes my expected utility. So I multiply the probabilities by how much I like each of those outcomes. Whichever one maximizes utility, that's the one I select. And there's all sorts of great theorems that say that's the way to go if you want to get the most goodness in the long run, right? But what that means is that you're keeping track of the entire probability distribution over all hypotheses that you've considered. And it's quite possible if I add a new one and recompute over the whole, that it's going to suddenly have this peak in a part of the hypothesis space that was considered before, but is neither the one that had the maximum posterior probability before, or the new one that you just added. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What's interesting is that there's always, you look at the distribution always for a given set of hypotheses.
Exactly.
Like, once you have considered them, you've got the distribution.
Right.
Like, you do not have, by definition, the hypothesis you haven't considered yet, it's not in your distribution. And deciding whether to generate a novel hypothesis, how to look for it, and whether to generate something and try to add it to your distribution. I don't think the Bayesians have a very clear story about that part, because it's always like you have the hypothesis already in some way on the table, and we're talking about cases when it's not.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely value of information sorts of accounts where that expected utility is over how much value would it be for me to take an action that doesn't get me berries, but gets me more information about where I might find berries in the future. But that's typically cast as getting more data rather than getting more hypotheses to consider.
Yeah. So we are talking about taking the move of adding the hypothesis to your distribution. And yeah, that can have, actually, some of the claims that we've made about what's happening in cost-benefit ratio calculations can be recast in these terms as saying, like, even if the hypothesis that you've added, it turns out it sucks, but you have recalibrated your distribution.
Right,
So
exactly.
now you're in a better place than you were before. So maybe you've downgraded the one that was higher and the third one came out on top, or the new one came out on top. Still, you're better off.
But the idea is how to make that jump, right, in the first place. Like, when should we make that jump about exploring that new? Thank you for putting it that way.
Thank you.
So this reminded me, like, sort of why I was asking the question I was asking earlier about, is this about like perfect rational agents and how they could do this kind of thing, or is it about humans? And part of the reason I was asking about that is because they're like, in the idea of coming up with these new hypotheses that might reshape your distributions, it requires that you can think of new hypotheses, right? And there's like, if this is for humans, then there's this psychological limit, like maybe I can't think of the new hypotheses that would reshape the distributions, right? And then I was thinking about this even from the rational agent perspective, and they're perfect rational agents, they can come up with all the hypotheses. If they could come up with new hypotheses, they would already have them in there. So there's like, I'm having trouble figuring out where it is that, like, how this is going to apply when you would have a hard time getting these new hypotheses. Like, where are you going to get them from?
I think it's an interesting intersection with like resource rationality. So there's rationality in the abstract for an infinite agent with an infinite set of resources, and there's what is rational for an agent with a certain cognitive limitations, as we are. So I don't think, given that we have outlined some of the, given that there's uncertainty about whether you're going to be able to generate a hypothesis, I think our proposal holds, because you might achieve all these goodies just from the process of looking for an explanation. You might be in a better position, even if you don't find that explanation. That, like, you don't even get as far as having formulated a hypothesis and having recalibrated your whole distribution of probability over those hypotheses. You still might be better off. And ultimately, the resource rationality doesn't mean that you are incapable of generating novel hypotheses. You're just uncertain about whether you will generate a coherent hypothesis that will stand and you will be able to use it to evaluate the data. Now, for the agent that's already, you could argue, like, would it even be an issue for an agent that already has generated all possible hypotheses? I would say no, but it just doesn't, it's kind of like getting out of this problem of needing, you don't even need an explanation. Well, wait a minute, if you are an agent with unlimited set of resources, you have already generated every possible hypothesis, even though you can always combine them. That might not even be plausible, because you could generate more and more and more, combining them and mixing them and matching them. But if you have such a huge number of, like, you have generated all the hypotheses that could be, that meet some plausibility threshold, let's say. Would we say you need, you can crunch the numbers, compare the existing data against all of them, and you have the winner? Should you look for alternatives? Like if you already know that you've considered all the other ones and they're just, I think framing the question that way, that an agent already has all the hypotheses in a way at hand, whether or not that's plausible, that's not compatible with our proposal about should you consider alternatives that you have not considered, because that case just doesn't apply.
I agree. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say is that, like, if how would you know if you've gotten all the plausible ones right? And so if you don't know that, that's uncertain. Whether or not you come up with a new one is uncertain, and all those things are uncertain. Then how do you make this cost-benefit calculation there at the end to know that I should search for a new hypothesis? Right?
Well, I think the question of whether you have already considered everything possible, maybe we can, as humans with limited resources, we can take that off the table. But how do you estimate all of those things? We're not saying that it's easy, right? Because you might have to deal with, just go based on the ideas like, well, in the past when astronomers considered an they already had a good working hypothesis. They considered something different and they kind of won a lottery with that. It was a lot better. Like, does this give you a concrete number for how much you can expect to get from taking extra 5 minutes and considering alternative explanations for the fact that a member of a certain category just got hired in your department? You're going to have a lot of large confidence interval on that number. We're not saying how easy it is to do that, how plausible it is to do it. There will be cases when it's going to be very hard to do this, but we're not saying, but I think you can still enter other numbers, like, can I get ahead just by thinking about this topic and learning by thinking in the absence of new data? I might be better off from that. So you can say that my probability of hitting conceptual jackpot is very low, but I might still become a better epistemic agent if I spend some more time thinking about this. You decide what the numbers are. But we're just saying there are combinations that might come out in favor of doing it.
So it sounds like, based on how you described it, that it's always going to be beneficial to search for a new explanation, new hypotheses. I'm just wondering, if you talk about, like, when does it not beneficial?
If you don't have time or cognitive resources, I'm not saying it's always going to be beneficial. I'm saying there are always things that you could put in the benefit side of the ratio.
Mm.
But there are plenty of things you can always put on the cost, such as just time and effort of doing that. And that idea also just social cost, that might be unpopular. I don't think you'll run out of costs.
Generate more.
So I think we'll go.
Well, it was actually directly playing off of that last comment. And also throughout the discussion, there's been references to a really possibly toxic form of motivated explanation, where it really is primarily about arriving at a conclusion that suits some ulterior end or agenda. And thinking about this not from a normative point of view, but from a what actual humans do point of view, that strikes me as a really, really important, if not what your project is, but an aspect of what people might do with this kind of work, is to try to characterize in a somewhat formal way how it is that people can arrive at flat earth beliefs, or at least avowed flat earth beliefs, or things of that nature, or attitudes about group stereotypes and so forth. But I wonder what you think about extending the work in this way, specifically, is that the same? Like, I doubt that in some cases people are engaging in this kind of explanation process at all. It might be better captured as a different kind of psychological process wherein something like a hypothesis or some question in the world is presented to the person, and not through considering or weighting different potentials or looking at past data or any kind of rational process, but rather something much more elegant happens, and whatever is convenient for who they are in their society or their network, they just say the thing, and then the cognitive work is in how do I justify through complete sophistry what I have my position, I know my position, it's dictated by the circumstance of my agenda, so how do I then justify it? That's one way of thinking about how people end up with these things. And another would be, no, they do something along the lines that you sketched here, but their values are just highly skewed. And yet they are sort of crunching data and arriving at the wrong answer, but only because the values are skewed, but via something like the same process. So what do you think? Do you think there's a typology of processes, or is it just the values in your overarching model?
No, I think all those things that you're listing, they're probably happening. Well, I can be uncertain about whether people are doing what we are proposing, but there's a lot of empirical evidence suggesting that there are all sorts of psychological mechanisms that support confirmation bias. There are attentional processes when you just don't see contradictory evidence. There are memory-based processes where you see it, but then you forget it somehow. There are also processes involving cognitive dissonance resolution, where first you do some action and then you need to, because people don't like to have their beliefs disagreeing with their actions, and actions often can't be fixed because you've already said those things, you've done those things, you adjust your beliefs to match your actions. That's all happening. Now, luckily or unluckily, humans are very complicated beings, so any all these sorts of things seem to be implemented in a variety of different mechanisms. And all we can say is, like, should we add this as a potential mechanism to the list? And I think we should at least consider it. So that's where we can take our normative proposal and apply it in a descriptive sense to get data to see whether people are actually doing this and when they're doing this, what makes them do this more or less. But the fact that that's not the only thing they're doing does not disqualify this whole idea of getting descriptive data on this proposal.
Should we ask you?
No.
Okay. So I thought that was really interesting talking to you very much. So this is kind of a friendly suggestion / question, challenging kind of thing. But so I took it to be that you're presenting a normative model on when to explain, and you were, is that so far so good? And then you were like kind of introducing a cost-benefit analysis, and that was the presentation of when it's to be rational to seek an explanation. So far so good?
Mm-hmm.
So the meaning of rational in that context was like a cost-benefit analysis for me, like what's the payoff for David in his life or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems like a weird way of thinking about what would make me, for instance, like a rational believer. So it seems a little bit like the values that I'd want to have in the cost-benefit analysis would in some way want to be relevant to knowledge. So anyhow, just a suggestion is perhaps by recommending that a kind of cost-benefit analysis, that maybe you need more, you could say that it's rational to have more relevant inputs to the belief that's to be formed.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, I'm kind of thinking about Amelia's question in the beginning. Something like, it turns out that my friends believe this, that shit just doesn't matter when it comes to whether something's true. And so if I weight it in the calculus, it has a sort of problematic place in the calculus. So anyhow, the suggestion is maybe something like if the idea is that we're entertaining a rational cost-benefit analysis, that's relevant to belief formation or justification endorsement, that we want the values in there to be relevant to that explanation.
No, thank you very much. That's a great characterization of the proposal and pointing out what it does and what it doesn't do in the current form. Yes, it's kind of subjective normativity. And it doesn't specify what kind of a generally rational, like how, if we wanted the world made of rational beings, what should they be like? It doesn't do that. Like, yeah, giving your screwed up goals, how should you behave rationally? That's kind of what we're saying. Well, maybe potentially screwed up goals. And I think it would be great to extend the proposal in the way that you are suggesting. I'm not sure how exactly we would do that, because there we're just saying that some values are more rational than others, right? And you could go and argue with people in an oil company saying that it's more rational not to focus on profit, and they will say, no, it's more rational to. So I think that's a supplementary project that's very big and complicated. And I don't think, I personally don't think I could do that. But it would be great if somebody could.
Sorry, I'll just leave it alone after this, but it just seems to me that rationality means different things across the different ways you've used it.
It does,
explanation.
yes.
And so I understand why oil company executive would be motivated not to look at the evidence, but it'd be hard pressed to call it rational, at least in the sense that we think that knowers are rational. Like, does that make a little sense? So, like, if you want the calculus to be sort of practical in some way, that's like one thing, but I don't think it quite gets you rational believers. Does that make, you see what I'm saying? So there's different senses here of rationality. One is narrow means ends, egoist rationality. And then there's like another one about like human rational agents, law knowers. So sorry, maybe we don't want to call them agents then, knowers. And that those senses of reason don't seem like they're identical to me. And hence when you're like making this recommendation about what the normative need for explanation, it seems like you might want to you could potentially keep better track of that, and then you could get a stronger test.
I think we have kind of an entry point to that. If we say that if you might want to have a coherent set of values and goals. So if you have, let's say, if you think that you want the world to be fair and you don't want the world to end in the next couple of centuries, like if that's if that's included in your set of goals, then you also shouldn't have certain goals and values that would contradict that. Like, oh, then it's better to, like, if you still want to work for an oil company and prioritize profits, that contradicts those values. So if we just add that clause, like, you should deal with a coherent set of values, then I think we might solve some of those problems. But if you take like a supervillain who has a coherent set of evil values, how would you deal with that? Like, how would you tell that they're irrational? They're not misrepresenting the world, they're just evil.
You're asking me?
Yes.
Okay. So it just strikes me, so these are different questions altogether. So the question about like what world outcome I want doesn't look like it's identical to the question about what's true about the world. Does that make sense? So like, it seems to me that if my climate science is motivated by the idea of, is merely motivated by the idea that I don't like the way things are going right now and I want them to change. It seems to me that I have just the same problem in reverse, which is that those are irrelevant considerations to the question of what's happening now. Does that make sense? And so the supervillain with the like coherent sets of values, that's at least as I am understanding it, a sort of orthogonal consideration to what's true about the matter. Does that make sense? Although I like your idea about like holism or coherentism about value, and that'll help us have a sort of lever to move people because their values are incoherent in certain kinds of ways. So that strikes me as more plausibly efficacious in the case of practical reason and like judgments about what to do, than views about what's true about the world.
So you
Sorry, I said I'd shut up before. So.
well, no, this is very interesting. So when we describe epistemic goals, if one of your epistemic goals is to have accurate beliefs about the world, then accurate and coherent set of beliefs. So that should take care of you working towards becoming a rational knower, right? But can we tell people, like, you have to endorse those epistemic values? Because that's what you're suggesting, and you have to endorse the value of having true, accurate
There
beliefs.
is one sense of rationality. Yeah.
If you're going to be a rational
How we-
believer, that's my view. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
So I say, qua epistemic realm, that's the only like card. Those are the only point of the realm. And then
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, I think we can make that more. So we kind of have been saying, like, you have a set of epistemic values where you value accurate, true, simple, parsimonious hypothesis. So in one package of, like, you want to have good epistemic standing, but accurate, like truthfulness. If you give up on that, like, we shouldn't say if you do that, right? If we want to have a more overarching or the proposal that's more about rationality in general, then we shouldn't give people the door to,
Yeah,
like,
totally.
I'm gonna not check that box. I'm not gonna want true, accurate beliefs. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, thank you very much for pushing us to clarify that.
So I guess this is going back to something Woman said a lot earlier. As a normative theory, you're simply thinking, how would you actually roll this out, right? If everyone bought onto this, what would it look like in practice, right? The new science that came out of the increased emphasis on rationally deliberating about the need for explanation. So what, like, if you had your druther, what would be the first step? Would it be like a section in your paper, like I pre-registered my hypothesis and now there's a short statement of the cost-benefit analysis I did and the values that went into it? And what would be a practical way to begin implementing this?
There comes that awkward moment when you realize your proposal is absurd.
No, like what you're, I mean, I'm thinking of what you are doing, for example, with the children, when you poke them with, cues
Not
to make
physically
them.
poking children.
Right.
No. Sorry. When you give them all these, comments to entice them to look for an alternative explanation or to look for a specific explanation, like what you are doing with structural explanation versus, other kinds of explanations. So I'm thinking, that it could be a set of, instructions like this way, like things we could follow or, trainings we could follow to invite this, kind of explanation seeking. And it can be, we don't want to get into this idea of epistemic virtues about, you training yourself about, I'm going to become a better agent by seeking explanations, when it's appropriate. But maybe it can be like what you can do to a second person, or some training that you can get about how we can poke people or nudge people into, with a specific environments or how we can design an environment to entice, to invite this kind of, behavior. I don't know, I'm just, going by here.
I'm going to switch from this imposes absurd requirements on scientists to
That's
that
scientists. After what you say, I have to say something.
I'm going to switch to scientists are kind of already doing this. And the idea is that you need to have done your due diligence in your paper, although it doesn't take the form of a specific section where you say this is what I've done and why. So in any good paper, you want to see the authors having considered alternative explanations for their data and either rule them out with additional experiments or give some sort of conceptual argument why they think this is not the case. And if they did not do due diligence considering those hypotheses, then the reviewers will. So we have some of this already built in scientific practice. And as a reviewer, when you receive a paper, you always like it more when people have considered alternative hypotheses and ruled some of them out. Again, they haven't ruled all of them out, and maybe they just ruled out the ones that were convenient to rule out. But you see that they fit the data to multiple models, and they have reasons to, they're arguing to have reasons to go with the one that they proposed, or sometimes, different one. So I think this is happening in science, and this is just something we could be doing more at, without the anticipation of 3 reviewers reading your paper. And we could be more, I guess, I don't want to be the one saying you need to have that awkward section in the paper where you really list your values.
But again, I think it's already there. Look, not at papers, but at grant proposals. When you see a grant proposal, you say, I want you to support this action of exploring this new hypothesis. Part of that argument is going to be, given what data, does it make sense to explore a new hypothesis here? But part of it is, if I turn out to be right, then I cure all of these diseases, which is entirely a value-based component to that whole evaluation of the project. Right?
That's why grant proposals are not so awkward. Broader impacts especially.
Right.
But yeah, we are forced to be explicit about it sometimes.
Maybe as a component of education at some level, not the graduate or undergraduate level, just having discussion of values that go into need for explanation, deliberations. Just if it was part of the culture to think about that, I guess that would be a first step of implementing this.
Well, Saray is teaching a wonderful course in science and human values.
It's all about that, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think I think how all this started. I think, if I remember well, because it was a long time ago. Because it's this how striking it is when you start thinking about values. Values in science or in general how we explain the world. It's interesting to see that only certain proposals that go against commonly accepted explanations, those are the ones that are seen as guided by values. So the ones that we accepted, those are value neutral. These are the true ones, these are the ones that we have more data supporting it. And then you propose an alternative. Again, I'm thinking about sex differences, or all these scientists who are doing research on reviewing tons of studies in the 70s on sex difference and saying the data actually do not support the idea that there are 2 different kinds of people. And then it's like, oh, you are just motivated by your ideology, by your politics. You are not looking at science. You are not seeking truth. You are just following your values. So this idea of that was striking to me about what actually would move someone to actually seek an alternative explanation when they are comfortably sitting on one that it works, and it coincides with social norms, it coincides with a lot of things that we accept. So why should I move from here? So this idea of acknowledging that you are also guided, you are sitting there comfortably because there are all these values that are you are taking with that kind of explanation. But then once you acknowledge that, then you could go anywhere. You could say, what if you move to different values? So what if you actually with epistemic values like I want to seek truth most than anything, then maybe you are still responsible to look for alternative explanation that actually fit the same data. So actually you are wrong if you think that is the only or the ultimate truth hypothesis. So it all started thinking about this idea of, it's so striking how for many people it's only the alternative that is guided by values, and yours is the one that is neutral and non-political and scientific and true. I don't know what I was saying this, but I needed to vent about it.
But if we, based on the suggestion from the back, if we don't let people come out of not seeking truth, otherwise they're rational, then they have to
Yeah.
go along. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, actually, I was going to make reference to your comment about the idea that this kind of puts a burden on an epistemic responsibility upon people that claim that they know things. That if you are going to make the statement, I know this, it kind of must imply, if it's going to be, a rational claim, that they've actually explored these opportunities or these alternative hypotheses. So it does sound like even if you do limit this to rationally speaking about knowing or not knowing, you still kind of bound everybody that makes any claims about knowing anything or nothing, just by virtue of the fact that, well, if they are committed to some sort of statement about knowledge as it relates to truth about the world, then they're also committing to the fact that they have to make some claims about alternative hypotheses as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think, I think that what you guys have here is very interesting for scientific hypotheses, but it also extends very naturally into, just day-to-day claims about the world. Just throwing that out there is something that I thought was interesting.
We're kind of going along with what's happening in science, but we are moving from this hypothesis testing. You have my hypothesis, the null hypothesis, that my hypothesis is not true, and you just work with that, to more sophisticated statistical methods of fitting multiple models, evaluating fit. It's, as I said, the spirit is the same.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a question. So if you were going to update it, like for educational purposes, the standard scientific, like the process of discovery doesn't really matter, and then you just make your hypothesis, and then you try to deductively rule it out, and then if you haven't deductively ruled it out, it still continues, or the Popperian scientific method, the one that is typically still taught as a scientific method in undergrad classrooms. If you were going to change that in one way, would you change that first point, like the discovery is not the right word, but anyhow, like the moment of inspiration, is that the moment when you should be, or is it what adjustment to that basic model? Where would you put the rational need for explanation in there? Like when should we, in this basic model, encourage people to be seeking it?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that.
So it'd be really interesting if this was applied to education, if we could start teaching a slightly different way to keep up with the way science has evolved.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly that that version of the scientific method is all wrong. But how should we be thinking about it, the process? Maybe for the next talk.
Yeah, no, this is a
great question.
No, this is making me think a lot about what it would be the next step. Thinking about because one of the points that we make is about this would put you seeking alternative explanation would put you in a better place to understand how science itself works.
Yeah.
Right? So it's totally, we should think about then, how can we improve, science education in this sense?
Yeah.
It's shifting emphasis definitely towards hypothesis generation.
At the beginning.
Yes. But also, we just know less about how that works and how to do that right. What we are saying is you're going to be better off trying and looking without offering any recipe for how to actually do that.
Yeah. I don't know if there is something we can learn from children. If I remember well, you have told me about all these experiments, how children are much better by considering wild explanations, sometimes too wild, because a dinosaur came and gave me this thing, right? But it's true that we keep, it's good that as we grow as adults, we narrow down, right, the set of hypotheses we consider, and that's good. We are faster and better, but maybe there is something that we are missing. So I don't know if there is something, if in this education there is something we could learn from children. I'm talking here, I don't know much.
Definitely, this is Alison Gopnik's terrain, but the children are more exploratory than adults. As adults, we become a lot better and efficient with dealing with narrow range of problems, and we do a lot of things on autopilot. But then best scientists, they kind of go back to being like children, considering wild and crazy hypotheses that nobody has considered. So there isn't a single recipe of like, don't ever narrow your range of hypotheses, because then you would remain as inefficient as a 3-year-old. So we have to find some balance, but maybe we can turn. This actually is happening a lot in AI systems now, when instead of like training them on a narrow range of options, we're trying to build them as kind of more like more like children that who explore a lot of different hypotheses, and are just assigning different weights to the hypothesis to begin with, or sometimes being more conservative with updating the values. But this interacts a lot with the environment that you are in, and children are in this protective environment where they're protected from errors. So we give them this childhood, so they mess around for a long time. I don't have like a number to give you, like how should we set this balance, given that as adults we are dealing with slightly different problems than children. And then if you make it, if you're lucky to be scientists, you get to play more, but only, like you don't want to be too inventive and consider crazy hypotheses while you're driving, only in your lab.
Or even in your lab, you might not get a grant next time, right?
Sometimes you're less likely to get a grant for a good hypothesis that's too exploratory.
That's true.
So I think that's opens a whole new
Yeah, that's a
discussion
new
that
thinking.
I would definitely love to
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah.
So if anyone has any thoughts in
Suggestions,
relations to this or our proposal, feel free to contact us.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear more.
Thank you, Saray and Nadya.